Hello, my name is Matthew Orman. I'm Director at the Sustainable Soils Alliance and Communications Lead for the Land Use for Net Zero People and Nature, or LUNZ Hub. In case you don't know, quick overview of the hub. The Land Use for Net Zero Nature and People Hub is a 4-nation, government-funded, 40-month project which looks to mobilise and support research to work in partnership with government and industry to tackle net zero through action in the land use sectors, essentially bridge the gap between research, policy and practice. Today actually marks the halfway point of the hub's lifespan, so it's very fitting that we're discussing one of the most exciting and innovative aspects of the hub's work, namely Work Package 3, the Net Zero Futures platform. To talk us through the work, I'm delighted to be joined by the Work Package 3's 2 leads, Star Molteno, who is a principal consultant at Eunomia Research and Consulting, and Professor Paula Harrison, principal natural capital scientist at UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. It's a pre-recorded session. Everything will be uploaded onto the website, including the slides and a brief overview. I will be asking them a series of questions that they've seen in advance about their work, the progress that they've made, the stakeholders that they've been working with and how, and alongside that, getting them to explain some of the fundamental underlying pieces of terminology that underpin their work. So to kick us off, Star, could you provide a quick overview of the Net Zero Futures platform in the Land Use for Net Zero Hub and explain how it fits in with the rest of the Hub's work?
Thanks, Matt. Yes, I'm happy to talk about this. It's worth remembering that one of the key aims of the Hub as a whole is to strengthen the way that research supports policy making. And it does this in a number of ways. So within Work Package 1, we have a rapid access to evidence. We can provide rapid pieces of research that policymakers are asking for. In Work Package 2, we aim to connect and have interactions between a wider range of stakeholders. So we have a creative methods lab and bringing stakeholders together to have interesting conversations, encouraging dialogue. And then in Work Package 3, we're trying to explore different views around how the future of the sector can develop in a positive way. So ideally, the sector of agriculture and land use continues to provide food for the nation, supports rural communities, but also contributes to reducing the scale of climate change and drives improvements in our degraded nature across the UK. And so this is why the Hub as a whole has 3 goals, that is net zero, nature and people. So in Work Package 3, we aim to bring together a range of voices to the table to sit alongside each other and policymakers in discussions about how this future could look. And importantly, we give space to each of the 4 nations to co-develop their own pathways and thinking about the futures before we work out what that means at a UK level. So this ties into our sort of overall aims that we've set it by saying that we want to develop a common land use scenario framework for the UK that is shared and accepted across the 4 nations. And to do that, we're going to be co-designing these pathways on how to transform land use for those 3 goals of net zero, nature and people. Some of the key questions that we're asking within this work are, what are the key drivers of land use change in the UK and how are they interacting? How are we likely to, what's the context going to look like between now and 2050? And what does our understanding of these drivers tell us about possible trajectories of change of land use and food production in this time frame? We really want to pinpoint what land use changes are needed to meet net zero and those wider environmental and socioeconomic goals. And within that, we need to understand what actions can be used effectively together to enable the land use changes to achieve those goals. We've developed a process across the lifespan of the Hub, and that started with an initial review of other scenarios and pathways and other land use models. So in April 2024, we had our first in-person workshop, and we had around 40 different stakeholders coming together from across the 4 nations to have questions around those kind of discussions around the questions that I've just been sharing with you. That helped us come away and think about, what does this shared scenario framework look like? And we then, in January and February of 2025, had a series of online workshops to co-create these pathways using the framework that we had developed from the first workshop. And currently we are at a point where we have analysed these workshops, and we are putting them out for wider consultation before we go and do the modelling to understand the impacts of the pathways that have been created. Moving a bit further forward, we give those stakeholders a chance to come back together to look at the pathways, to refine the pathways, and think about how does this connect up at a UK level. Again, we will then model the revised pathways, and that takes us to the kind of culmination where we should have a set of UK pathways that have strong buy-in from stakeholders across the 4 nations. So what we hope to achieve by the end of this is this shared scenario framework, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means as we go forward in this session. And we will develop these plausible pathways for each of the 4 nations that deliver on those 3 goals. We'll also be understanding the efficacy of those nations' pathways in terms of the impacts, also looking at the kind of co-benefits and trade-offs that the pathways present. And through that process, we will develop a final set of pathways for the UK and each of the 4 nations.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. 2 terms that you use a lot are pathways and scenarios, and I think these lie like the heart of your work. And I think we benefit from a bit of clarity of those. So maybe you could explain a little bit about exactly what you mean by scenarios and about the difference between a scenario and a pathway. And I think, Paula, that's one for you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So yeah, put simply, scenarios are representations of possible, or we use the term plausible, futures. And they're really useful because we know there are many factors that drive how the future may evolve over the coming years and decades. So scenarios are a tool that help us to explore the future, taking account of this uncertainty in how the future may unfold. Scenarios are generally presented as these plausible stories or narratives, and they describe sequences of events or actions into the future. But they can also be quantitative and linked to simulation models that help us then project what the impacts might be for changes in driver assumptions in the scenarios. But really importantly, scenarios are not predictions. They're a tool for exploring these alternative plausible futures. And there are different categories of scenarios. And as you mentioned, the terminology around scenarios can get confusing because of these different categorizations. But simplifying slightly, there are 2 main types of scenarios that are used in most scenario studies. And they're illustrated on this slide in a very simplified form. And the first on the left-hand side are called exploratory scenarios. And they tend to describe a range of plausible futures based on assumptions of how trajectories of drivers may change. So those drivers could be economic, technological, they could be related to policy or governance, or they could be social. So for example, how societies are structured or how societies use or consume natural resources. And these types of scenarios are really useful in understanding what might happen in the future under different levels of uncertainty in those drivers. Second type of scenario is on the right-hand side of this slide, and they're often referred to as either normative scenarios or target-seeking scenarios. And they generally describe different pathways, which consist of various policy actions or management interventions that help us to achieve a specific policy goal or target or a vision of a desired future. And those types of scenarios are really useful in understanding what we want to happen in the future. And this second type of scenario is also frequently referred to as pathways, hence a bit of confusion in the terminology. And this is because studies create these pathways either forwards, so following that red dotted line in the slide, from today to our vision or to our policy target, or they can be developed by backcasting from our vision or our policy target to today. Both ways will create different pathways to those targets. So in the net futures the Net Zero Futures platform, we are focusing on this second type of scenario, and we refer to it as pathways. Specifically, we're co-creating pathways to multiple policy targets that are related to net zero, nature, and people. And these targets are the endpoints of our pathways. Those endpoints might differ for each of our 4 nations, but they're broadly around the endpoint of 2050. Our pathways consist of combinations of specific actions, and those are either sequenced or prioritized in different ways with the intention of meeting those policy targets by around 2050. And the actions we define then as more specific interventions or measures, and that they can be implemented by different actors. So it could be, for example, a farmer incorporating herbal leys into their arable rotations, or it could be a landowner implementing actions related to the restoration of upland peatlands. We also consider how our scenarios might be affected by a wide range of drivers. And these drivers are factors that can influence the future of land use or the effectiveness or those feasibility of those implementing those specific actions on the ground. We classify these into different driver categories. So, for example, social drivers might include public attitudes and values or farmer identity or consumption. Technological drivers might be agri-food tech, economic drivers might be things like the global and domestic markets or green finance, and policy drivers tend to include things like agriculture, climate and biodiversity policies, but can also include important factors such as land ownership or tenure, or broader drivers such as geopolitical stability.
Thank you. Could you describe your pathway development framework? And also, why did you start with proto-pathways as nature, either nature or climate leading? Why these two, as it were, extremes? Star, I think that's for you.
Yes, it is, Matt. So, as you can see, Paula has just explained really clearly what we're trying to do, but when we're looking at futures in this space, it's complex. There's a lot of moving parts. There's actions, there's drivers, there's goals and targets. And we're aware that work previously to now has just used different terminology, thought about it in different ways, chopped up, the different actions in different ways. And that is one of the obstacles to really understanding the main messages that are coming across all the pieces of work and the different approaches taken in the 4 nations. So one of those the goals that we have within this program of work was to develop a common framework that we can use and that people can use easily and use to communicate about change in this sector in a common way. So we started our work with this from the consultations in workshop 1. And we talked about, with those stakeholders, the kind of language they're using and what the needs are for these pathways. And from that, we developed a kind of common and comparable structure to help us develop a new set of pathways for the 4 nations. And within this sort of set of this framing that we're doing, we're trying deliberately to keep it quite simple. So we're also trying to give space to allow each of the nations to bring in their own specific needs and their own interpretations, but coming from that common starting point. And what we hope is that this will enable new conversations and learning about net zero nature that avoid some of those sort of misunderstandings where you realize you're talking with somebody and actually you're talking about the same thing but from a different point of view, whether that is, what are we thinking about when we mean afforestation? Are we picturing blanket conifer plantations across a lot of Scotland? Are we picturing broad-leaved, continuous cover forestry in southeast of England? What are we actually thinking about? How do we talk together about those things? And that this will help us develop a kind of balanced pathway. And we're also encouraging people to be transformative. So in the next slide, I think if you will go on, Paula, this is the sort of thought process that we've developed that we think is simple enough to help people engage with it and structure their thinking. So in the pathway development framework, we start with a current trends pathway that we develop based on current research and literature about how we think things might evolve in the future. And in the workshops that we've held this year, we encouraged people to think about quite an extreme position. What if they were trying to develop a pathway that was solely focused on reaching those nature goals within their own nation? What would that look like? What combination of actions would be required to achieve that? And then the other group was asked to think purely with a kind of emissions head on. What if they're thinking just about the climate goals and that's the sole focus, because they believe that that is the bigger crisis that we need to address before all other things. And from that sort of more extreme position, the two groups came together and looked at what they'd made and talked about what trade-offs and balances were required to make a balanced pathway that could possibly deliver on both those sets of goals. And from that balanced pathway, we are offering the stakeholders again a chance to come back and think about, once they understand the impacts of that pathway, how could we be transformative with this? How can we extend that pathway or scale back ambition so that it's realistic, so that we've got a truly transformative, balanced pathway for each nation? I hope that's answered.
Thank you. Paula, back to you. Could you explain how the pathways were created and what do they look like?
Yes, certainly. So I'll talk you through a series of slides that sort of explain and demonstrate what we did in that second series of workshops that Star introduced at the beginning. So this was a series of 4 workshops, one for each of the UK nations. And to enable comparability across the 4 nations, each workshop started with a common set of actions as the building blocks for the pathways. And these were divided into 8 broad categories, and they're the coloured large boxes on these slides. So they go from arable and horticulture, livestock, farm level management, energy, woodland, habitats, peatlands, and socioeconomics, with a number of different actions within each of those broad categories, realizing that you can't possibly read them on this slide. But again, this is just to illustrate what was presented to the stakeholders. What we asked the stakeholders then to do was review those action sets. They could elaborate them, they could expand them by adding additional actions until they were happy that they reflected their national context. What we then asked them to do was prioritize those actions into the grid that's on the right-hand side of this slide, according to whether they consider those actions to be in either very low, low, high, or very high priority, according to the primary goal for the pathway. So again, as Star introduced previously, that we started looking at extreme pathways for climate leading and nature leading pathways. So they did this exercise thinking through the primary goals, which were either meeting net zero for the climate leading pathway or reversing biodiversity loss for the nature leading pathway. What we then did with those same stakeholder groups is we asked the stakeholders to discuss and agree which actions in their pathways they considered to be particularly game-changing in terms of really moving significantly towards achieving the goals of their pathways. We then also asked which drivers would be really important to enable on-the-ground implementation of those actions. And those were the little white circles that they then added across their priority grid of actions. And then finally, the stakeholders discussed and agreed what were the core elements that really underpinned the narrative of that pathway. And in undertaking these sessions, we actually started with 2 climate leading pathway groups and 2 nature leading pathway groups during the process. And that was really to maintain that diversity of opinions between the different stakeholders involved in this process. And then in a later exercise in the workshop, we merged those into a single climate leading and a single nature leading pathway. What we did after we had developed those extreme pathways, again, as Star explained, we then worked towards moving towards creating a balanced pathway. And we did this by overlaying the priority grids for the climate leading and the nature leading pathways, and asked the stakeholders to really look at the synergies and trade-offs between the different actions in those pathways, bearing in mind that they now needed to try and achieve multiple goals related to climate, nature, and people. So this discussion was then noted in all those many white post-its that are around the side of our priority grid. And these were used as part of this discussion to agree a set of balancing compromises that stakeholders could agree on how they reprioritize their actions, or whether they needed to add additional actions to the pathway, potentially to address trade-offs. And then finally, coming out of that second set of workshops, we did an awful lot of analysis. We had some very rich outputs to analyze. And what we have produced are these 1.5 to 2 page pathway narratives. And we've also produced a sort of a simplified version of that action priority grid, which shows how stakeholders prioritize different actions in these categories from very low to very high. And what we've been doing during June and July 2025 is sharing those with the participants of those workshops, as well as some wider stakeholders through a consultation exercise for them to comment on how we've analysed their outputs and to help us validate them to ensure that they really reflect the discussions that happened during the workshops.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned stakeholders a few times. Maybe you could say a few words about the kind of stakeholders that you've had involved in creating the pathways, and also the opportunities that stakeholders that haven't been to the workshops, how they can participate. Star, I think that's for you.
It is, thank you. I wonder if you can just flash to the next slide first, Paula, for a second, just to give a flavour of some of the workshops. There we go. So this was our in-person workshop in Manchester. We had around 40 participants from across the 4 nations, and there were policy representatives from government from each nation, as well as other kind of stakeholders. So it was a very rich day, a lot of discussion and talking. But you can see we had the scope to get 40 people in a room together. That's difficult when you're trying to get a broad range of views from each of the 4 nations. If you go back to the last slide, Paula, thank you. So in the second round of workshops, we were holding these online in order to make it open to a wider range of people. We ended up with 88 stakeholders attending. These were 2-day online workshops. So we were asking people to commit for 6 hours a day, 2 days in a row, which is a big time commitment. So bearing that in mind, we were really grateful that all these people were able to give their time and participate. And we had good representation from each of the 4 nations across these kind of different groups. So we had government policymakers, we had government agencies, we had industry organizations, commercial consultants, landowners, managers, NGOs, and also research organizations and higher education institutions. You will probably say, where are the farmers within this? I would like to add that some of these individuals are also farmers, so they brought those voices and direct experience. But a lot of these people work directly with farmers. When we can get a limited number of people in the room, our strategy was, let's work with people who can reach out and connect to a broader community through their own work, but are thinking strategically about futures. So those are the kind of stakeholders that we've been engaging with. We feel like we've got a good representation. These are the people who've directly created the pathways with us, and they are providing the responses at the moment to the consultation, but the pathways are being made available to the rest of the consortium just for their interest, to have a look, to comment on directly to us if they want to. And we hope as we go forward, these pathways will become more of a talking point within the hub as a whole, and something that we can use to dialogue with wider stakeholders.
So once you've developed these pathways, how do you then go on to evaluate them? And in particular, what models do you use in that process? And what exactly do they enable you to assess? Paula, I think that's for you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So maybe if I just step you through the process that and how evaluating our pathways via modelling, it was integrated into this second set of workshops, and then what we're planning to do following those workshops in terms of the modelling activities. So in addition to using that second set of workshops to co-create the narratives and the action grids that I was showing previously, we also dedicated some sessions to inform how we might parameterize a set of models in a way that is consistent with those pathway narratives and action grids, and then use them to evaluate the pathways. So in these, the outputs of these sessions, and I'll give you a little bit more flavour of that in a later slide, we We then were analysing these as a project team. That included sense checking that they were consistent with all the qualitative information we had around the pathway narratives and the actions, but also doing desk research to really look at actually, okay, is it feasible what the stakeholders were saying in terms of how we could parameterize our models in terms of the level of ambition for some of those actions. And of course, we're going, including in our consultation exercise, this information on the pathway parameterization for the modeling. What that will eventually do, following the end of this consultation period, is it will help us define inputs to 4 different models that will be used to enable an evaluation of the pathways. We'll be looking at the feasibility of those pathways, so how can they be implemented on the ground? But this also includes actually how effective are those pathways in achieving the different policy targets, but also then looking at different impacts, co-benefits and trade-offs. So, for example, those associated with land use, or how land use might be projected to change using those models, and then what might be the consequences for greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity and food production. And the idea is the outputs from this modelling will then form the input for this next 3rd workshop, which will be in person again when we bring the 4 nations to get back together to compare their outputs in January 2026. So just jumping into sort of some of those things I've raised there in a little bit more detail in the following 2 or 3 slides. So this slide here illustrates basically how we use the sessions in the 2nd set of workshops to try and inform this model parameterization. So we had a first session that took place after stakeholders had developed their action prioritization grids, and that's what's shown on the left-hand side of this slide. And again, this was for just those extreme climate leading and nature leading pathways. So in this session, we first asked stakeholders to vote on options that they considered were consistent with their pathways in terms of how certain parameters in our model might change. So an example of this is the table in the upper part of this slide, where we were asking stakeholders to vote on the split between woodland planting that might be broadleaf or conifer in both the climate leading and the nature leading pathways. Then in a second session, on the 2nd day of the workshop, after stakeholders had developed their balanced pathway, we had another quantification session. And an example of that is in the lower table in this slide. And here we presented back to stakeholders the assumptions that we were planning to use for the modelling in our current trends pathway, the outcomes of the voting that they'd done the previous day for parameter values for the climate leading and nature leading pathways. And then we asked them to comment on how the parameterization for the balanced pathway would differ from those other pathway parameterizations. And again, stakeholders had some flexibility on the types of comments they could provide us with, whether they were specific quantitative values or whether they were issues or things that we needed to consider when parameterizing the model. And the table at the bottom again, this is an example for our 4 livestock parameters that we needed information on. So these are things like improvements in milk yields or the relative adoption of feed additives. Again, as I mentioned previously, we are now, after analysing the outputs from the workshop and creating a quantification table that summarises how we will parameterize the models, we've now put that out for consultation with the stakeholders that attended the workshops. And again, here, this is so that they can see whether they reflect their comments during the workshop, but they can also provide further comments, further evidence to help us finalise the parameterization that we will use before we start the modelling. And again, the example here in the slide is just different ways of parameterizing our 4 pathways, current trends, the climate leading, the nature leading, and the balanced pathway for how we might represent agroecological practices in our models. But this is just one parameter of many that were in that quantification table that went out to stakeholders. And then just finally, just to dig into the actual modelling in a little bit more detail, here this slide provides information on how the 4 models that are used in the project are linked together as part of a modelling chain to do that evaluation of the pathways. So here first, we will apply those pathways to a model called the Fable land use model. And this is a simplified integrated model for simulating pathways for sustainable land use and food systems. And there are 5 versions we have of this model, one for the UK and then one for each of the 4 nations. And it produces outputs around land use, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity and food security for us to do a very initial assessment of the feasibility and effectiveness of those pathways. We then, to add greater detail, for example, on the greenhouse gas emissions, we take the outputs from the Fable model, as well as additional information from the pathways, and apply them to another model. In this case, it's a more specific emissions model that's used for computing greenhouse emissions, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide for the agricultural, forestry, and other land use sector, using the same suite of models developed by UKCH that have been used by the Climate Change Committee reports. Because the Fable model outputs are non-spatial, they're then input to a spatial allocation model to create maps of land cover use and management on a 1 kilometre grid, so we can look at sort of what the impacts might look over space across the UK and the 4 nations. And these spatial outputs are then passed to a series of environmental impact models that allow us to look at implications for things like the nutrient and sediment export, water yield, soil carbon, and agricultural production. And then finally, we're looking at doing a simplified cost-benefit analysis, which is really looking at some of the socioeconomic impacts qualitatively in the pathways, which is going to be supported by some case studies of implications across different farm types.
Thank you. You kicked off your work with workshops that took place across all 4 nations. It'd be interesting to know what differences you identified from one nation to the next, and also to know how these will be reflected in the UK-wide results. Star.
Thanks, Matt. So first of all, it's been fascinating sitting in on those different conversations and picking up on the kind of the different ways in which potential futures for land use are talked about. I think the fundamental thing is we can't escape the fact that the UK has a certain geography, and that affects the biophysical potential for agriculture and land use. So there's a very clear east-west divide across England, where we have the wetter, higher land in the west and lower, drier land in the east, which means that most of our livestock production sits along the west and Wales, Western Scotland, and west of England, and Northern Ireland. So it's not a surprise that within those conversations, the conversation around livestock production was really strong, particularly looking for ways to improve efficiencies in livestock production while maintaining production. In Scotland, there was an interesting, strong emphasis on how do we manage our deer. Deer was raised as a threat to potential afforestation projects, but also habitat management and landscape management in general. It wasn't a topic of conversation that came up in the other countries' groups very much. But there was a much a stronger sense of let's approach this at a landscape level when we're talking in Scotland. In England, one of the key features that came up that didn't come up in many of the other conversations was what do we do with lowland, peatland, arable production, given that it's very rich soils producing a considerable proportion of our arable production, and yet it is also contributing significantly to emissions. This kind of geographical, biophysical conversation is obviously mediated by the social and political context within each of the 4 nations. I think I'm highlighting here that there are key communities and key groups that have particular importance within each of the 4 nations. In Scotland, the rural communities and the Highlands and the crofters, the voices of those communities was brought out in the workshops quite strongly, and the real sense in which, farming isn't just an economic enterprise, it's a livelihood, it's how people connect with their land, and that we mustn't lose sight of that when we're talking about change. Similarly, in Wales, there's quite a polarized dialogue between the sheep farming communities and the desire to use the land for increased forestry. So again, it's those rural communities' voices. And that was more disparate in the conversations in England and so on, given the diversity, I suppose, that we have there. Again, this context is situated within the policy framework and how different governments are supporting change and supporting the agricultural sectors. And because this project has quite a long lifespan, we are sitting within a lot of policy changes as we're going. So initially, some of the conversations in England were looking at what is already supported within the sustainable farming schemes. Looks like that's going to be changing. Again, in Wales, when we had the workshops, it was fresh off a period of consultation on the farming scheme. So there was a lot of conversation around that. Northern Ireland is currently in a phase of consultation on its own climate plan. And Scotland also is in a point of shifting targets around climate and those goals. But Scotland also brought and has sort of institutionalized this concept of a just transition in a slightly different way from England. There was a conversation around the good food nation approach within Scotland and the importance of what we're eating and the quality of that and the health of our diets. So there's just a few nuggets to capture the kind of conversations that we were listening in on. How do we reflect these differences? Well, this is a few thoughts we've been having that, there are existing tensions right now between the targets for each nation set or guided by the CCC and the UK commitment to net zero, which is looking to balance reductions across all sectors. We are sort of sitting independently of that. So we're having this great opportunity to ask each nation, what do you think is realistic? Let's look at the outcomes of that, put it together. And none of us yet know how this is going to piece together. So this is kind of an open space. It's quite interesting. But that iteration of the pathways in January gives each nation as a group and also us as a collective the chance to reflect and reprioritize and consider those tensions between the goals. We also feel like the workshops in January will allow more of a conversation about what is feasible in each nation, given that biophysical constraints, given the social and political framing that we have, and the kind of government commitments that already exist. How we're going to get there, we don't fully know, but those are the ambitions.
Thanks, Star. That brings us neatly onto the final question, which is about your next steps. What are the final outcomes from this work? In the spirit of tag teaming, Paula, that's one for you.
Great, thanks, Matt. So yeah, in that same spirit of tag teaming, I'm kind of repeating the slide that Star presented right at the beginning, really highlighting where we are now, but also adding on right at the end when we get to the final outputs, how we'll give those back to the community. So just as a quick reminder, we've done a first workshop in April last year that was in person, and from that we got our shared framework. In January and February this year, we've done this series of 4 online workshops with each of the 4 nations, and we're now in the middle of modelling and evaluating the impacts, benefits and trade-offs within those pathways. We take them back to stakeholders in January next year. So the idea there in that workshop is to really allow the stakeholders to first co-learn from each other, so they understand actually how effective their own pathways have been in meeting targets and what impacts and co-benefits and trade-offs do they see, but they also get to learn from the other 3 nations. And we also give them the opportunity to revise their pathways. And because they're then revising their pathways, we will then go through this other round of modelling and evaluate them again with what we then will refer to as the final pathways. And those final pathways will be presented back to a wider stakeholder community in a final LUNZ Hub Big Tent event that will happen towards the end of the project. So probably towards late 2026, early 2027, where we'll be able to really see whether we are answering some of those questions that Star was just posing, i.e. actually how do things play out at the 4 nation levels, but also how do they aggregate up at the UK level. So what we really think will be the outcomes from the Net Zero Futures platform, and again, a slight repeat of what Star showed at the beginning, but in a simplified format. So our main outcomes will be this shared scenario or pathway framework that the 4 nations have co-created with us. So hopefully it is widely accepted across the UK and across different stakeholders, to allow some comparability, but also flexibility to allow some nation-specific context to come through in those pathways. That should be reflected in this sets of plausible pathways, where we will have this final iteration where each nation will have 4 pathways: a current trends, a climate leading, a nature leading, and a balanced pathway. We wait to see what might happen in our 3rd in-person workshop in January 2026 to see how they might vary slightly in terms of our final set. And we will have the modelling and evaluation of those pathways to actually really understand their efficacy in meeting policy goals, both at the 4-nation level and the UK level. And actually, what does that mean in terms of wider socio-economic and environmental impacts, and where are the synergies and trade-offs in those pathways? But ultimately, at the end of the project, we really want to get to the stage where stakeholders have confidence in our scenario and pathway framework, and in the pathways that sit within it, that they themselves have co-created with us. So we hope that they've bought into them. And they hope, and part of this is really hoping that they continue to keep reflecting this diverse range of stakeholder perspectives. And also that being aware, as Star was mentioning earlier, that we were limited on the number of stakeholders that we could involve. We had 40 stakeholders in our in-person workshop. We had 88 in our 2nd series. So that's quite a diverse set of voices, but it's nowhere near as comprehensive as the whole community we need to engage with these with these pathways. So we really hope that the stakeholders we've been working with closely end up being our voice to help amplify and the take-up of these pathways in other ways. And that includes by the research community. So we're also liaising closely with the research projects that have been funded under the same call of land use for net zero, to hope that they do also take up these pathways in their own projects. And that might be applying them directly, but using different models to evaluate them in different ways, or actually enriching them to look at more specific issues or more specific regions of the UK in different ways. But I guess ultimately we really hope that the pathways do guide this holistic and collective thinking across the UK nations and across different stakeholder groups around sustainable land use for net zero, nature and people going forwards.
Brilliant, very helpful, very interesting. Unless you've got any final closing remarks, I think we'll leave it there. Paula and Star, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good stuff.